The Weekly Wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Claire Kimball.
And I'm Jodie Spears.
We're starting with what's been the biggest news story this week, the Melbourne Childcare abuse scandal. I want to give listeners a bit of a warning. We're going to be mainly focusing on the policy issues that have come out of this, but we will be talking very briefly about the charges. So if you want to skip ahead, they're quite graphic, even just reading the charges. If you want to skip ahead, you might want to fast forward about 90 seconds and then you'll be good to continue.
Yeah, good point. Let's get the facts of what's known so far. On Tuesday, Victorian Police did a press conference and they announced that 26-year-old Joshua Brown from Point Cook had been charged with more than 70 offences relating to 8 alleged victims aged between 5 months and 2 years old. Enough to make your blood run cold. Along with the sexual assault allegations, he is accused of contaminating children's food with bodily fluids.
Yeah, so those charges relate to his time at one childcare centre in Melbourne's western suburbs, but Brown worked at 20 childcare centres across Melbourne and Geelong. That's between January 2017 and May 2025, which is when he was arrested. So it's an ongoing investigation given the scale of that.
Yeah, the scope is massive. Health authorities have contacted 2,600 families and they're recommending that 1,200 children undergo precautionary STI testing. A couple of points about Brown that we'll come to in a moment. He had a valid working with children check and he wasn't previously known to police.
Yeah, and also to note in the news, there's been a second arrest, a man named Michael Wilson. He's 36 years old. He's been charged with 45 offences. It's understood that Wilson's alleged offending isn't connected to the childcare facilities or any children alleged to be victims in the other case. Both men will face court on September 15. Just reading about it, the images that Brown allegedly took were found in Wilson's home. So that's the connection, the sense that they found the images and then they went after Josh Brown. So, yeah, that just to make that link for you.
Yeah, that makes it clear. So that's what happened. What happens next legally is fairly straightforward, court proceedings. But the policy response has been immediate and it's been sweeping.
Very sweeping. So let's start with the Victorian Premier, Jacinta Allen, who announced on Wednesday what she called urgent reforms. From the 26th of September, all Victorian childcare centres must ban personal mobile devices, making Victoria the first state to take that step. There's also an urgent review into childcare safety and that's due in the middle of August. They're looking at mandatory CCTV in childcare centres, questions about whether that would be all childcare centres or just ones that they think that they need to monitor. Also expanding registration systems for educators. Allen said families cannot wait for these changes.
Yeah, then to the federal response. Education Minister Jason Clare, who was very emotional about this when he was interviewed this week, he announced on Thursday that he will introduce legislation to cut funding to centres that employ child sex offenders, which brings us to how childcare actually works in Australia, which can be quite confusing. This is central to answering the question about who's actually in charge and responsible. It's a complex mix of federal and state responsibilities, and that's been exposed as problematic this week.
Yeah, we talk on this podcast a little bit about our cooperative federal state and how that all sort of works. It can get quite complex. So childcare is federally funded and it's also federally regulated. That's done through the National Quality Framework. But the states handle things like working with children checks and also the licensing of childcare centres. And just to note, I guess, on the money side, if you want to know the scale of the federal government's contribution, $16 billion annually in subsidies make childcare affordable for families. That comes from the feds.
Yeah, and there's strong private sector involvement in this industry to consider too, which has been a talking point this week. All 20 centres where Brown worked were private operations. 4 of them were owned by ASX-listed G8 Education, 9 by Affinity Education, which is owned by private equity firm Quadrant.
Yeah, so Quadrant's a big private equity international global firm. Profit, and that profit motive has really been under some pretty serious scrutiny. And reports this week quote former Affinity Centre staff saying that the way that they worked was profit at all times, one staffer said. When 70% of the costs are labour, the pressure to cut staffing and supervision is intense. That's what those who work in the sector say. Those issues has seen the childcare sector already put under some pretty serious scrutiny this year.
So in March, a Four Corners investigation found that 1 in 10 childcare centres has never been rated by regulators, never, and tens of thousands of children are in facilities that actually fail the national standards.
Yeah, and that investigation also found that centres can be rated as working towards standards, meaning that they don't meet minimum requirements, but they can still keep operating. When Jason Clare went on 7:30 on Thursday night, he was asked quite intense questions about that, saying, well, why don't you cut them off? Like, how are we still in this situation where the federal government is funding childcare centres that don't meet minimum standards? And there's some of the difficult questions that are coming out of this. Also, that Four Corners investigation pointed to is that there's about 47,000 kids in for-profit centres that don't meet national quality standards, and that there's serious staffing issues around fake qualifications.
Scary stuff. And that working towards description just sounds like such a euphemism, doesn't it, for failing to meet the standards.
And what those on the other side of it say, well, what, you shut it down and leave families without care? Like, that's the flip side. They're very difficult questions, yeah.
We should also note another nasty case. In November, Ashley Griffith, who's been dubbed one of Australia's worst pedophiles, was jailed for life in Queensland for abusing girls at childcare centres between 2003 and 2022.
Interesting to note that he had passed all the background checks as well and had worked undetected for nearly 2 decades.
Really highlights the problems with those checks, doesn't it? So lots of talks this week that the systems designed to protect children aren't working, clearly. And one of the big questions that I had was about the Working with Children check system. When you look into it, that check can be done online in 30 minutes. It's basically ticking some boxes from the sounds of things. And there are some reflected this week that getting a responsible service of alcohol certificate takes 10 hours of training, and I know that because I've done it. It's a full day of
You've done the RSA
training,
Yeah, lots of reflection on that. There's another big problem, and that is that the system isn't consistent across the country, and we know that when that's the case, people can fall through the gaps. So it's been nearly a decade since a very big Royal Commission recommended changes to that to make a standardised national system. We still have a patchwork system, though, in place, and that led that Royal Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald, to say that the delay was shameful.
Yeah, 10-year delay. The variations are significant. Some states only look at criminal convictions, while others consider professional misconduct allegations. The duration and name of the check also varies across the country. So in Queensland, for example, it's called a blue card. It's not the same everywhere. There are other issues as well, including questions about whether men should be allowed to work in childcare centres at all.
Yeah, a really big theme to come out of the coverage this week. It's a very thorny one, that one. Supporters of that idea point to the statistics. So between 2 and 4% of childcare educators are male, and what supporters of that idea say is that when you look at New South Wales in the non-school education system, there have been 142 sexual offences since March last year. All but 2 of those offenders were men.
Yeah, so they're just looking at those statistics. But there is significant pushback against a blanket ban. Early Childhood Australia's CEO, Sam Page, says that male educators are really important role models, especially for kids who might not have male figures at home. And she says that we should focus on setting up systems that protect all children from any sort of harm that an educator could cause.
Yeah, and Christy McVie, who's a former child abuse detective, she comments on these sorts of stories from time to time, as she did this week. She said, it's not gender that creates a predator, it's secrecy, unchecked power and silence. And she says, as you point to, more good men in the system is a good thing because they're good for kids, but they can also be good for their peers and essentially hold peers to high standards.
Men in Australian childcare already report being hypervigilant. You can imagine the feeling of thinking that suspicious eyes were on you. They say that they never want to be left alone with children and they feel more surveillance than their female colleagues. Lots of comments commentary this week that men do also tend to drop out of early childhood education programs after they experience distrust during their placements. And that's in a sector that already has severe staff shortages. I know that from my kids being at their centre. They found it so hard to get staff and to get good staff.
And to then say 50% of the population can't be eligible for a role in this sector, that would be a really big thing to shift to. Just to wrap this up, for the affected families, there's immediate support. There's also a $5,000 payment and a dedicated helpline. We'll put a link to information on that in the episode notes. But the longer term impacts on the industry, public confidence, all of those sorts of things, those issues are still unfolding. So it really feels like we're just at the beginning of a big conversation.
Yeah, it does. Just to add to, there's every chance that there are Weekly Wrap listeners who are directly or indirectly affected by this. So we just wanted to say we reckon this has probably been a really tough week. We will put a link to some services to contact if you need support.